Comes after Tyson Foods announced it was ending operations at a beef plant in Lexington, Nebraska, one of the largest in the nation.
Experts are saying the increases could come as a result of the new reciprocal tariffs put in place yesterday by President Trump. So what does all of this mean for our local beef, cattle, and pork farmers? Mark Livermore breaks that down.
Something unusual has been happening in North America's food market this week, and the strange part is how quietly it began. No headlines, no urgent government warnings, just a shipment paused at the Ontario border, a customs stamp that didn't show up, and a rejection notice that landed with none of the usual diplomatic sugarcoating. On paper, it looked like a routine border snag, but people inside the industry knew immediately this wasn't routine at all. Something deeper had split open, and within a couple of days, that hairline fracture stretched across the entire continent. What's unfolding now isn't some random supply chain slowdown. It's something much more serious, something that could reshape how the world sees American beef for years. A shift like this doesn't happen often, and when it does, it usually signals a major turning point in global trade. The first sign came when Tyson Foods, one of the biggest names in American meat production, announced it was closing its huge beef plant in Lexington, Nebraska, not cutting back, not pausing operations, shutting down completely. And before anyone could process that bombshell, Tyson said its Amarillo, Texas plant would also be rolling back to a single full shift. Official statements blamed market pressures and corporate restructuring, but ranchers weren't buying it. For months, they had been saying something felt off. Feed prices were through the roof, herd sizes were shrinking thanks to drought and soaring costs. Export buyers were pushing back harder and negotiating more aggressively, hesitating in ways they never had before. Some even delayed contracts, rare behavior in a global market that usually runs like clockwork. Then everything snapped into focus. Ontario rejected more than 150,000 tons of U.S. beef. Not a small hiccup, not one problematic shipment. 150,000 tons of product turned away. The announcement sent shockwaves from ranches in Nebraska to boardrooms in Washington. Canadian officials didn't bother with careful phrasing. They said plainly that escalating U.S. tariffs were hitting their agricultural sector hard, and they weren't going to just sit quietly anymore. If Washington wanted to use trade as a pressure tool, then Canada was going to push back. For decades, a Canadian rejection of U.S. beef at this scale would have been unimaginable. The U.S. and Canada built one of the most interconnected agricultural supply chains in the world. Their inspection systems align. Buyers and sellers depend on one another. They're practically extensions of the same market. And yet Ontario didn't hesitate. Even more surprising was how quickly the rest of the world reacted. Within 2 days, Japan trimmed its upcoming orders. Germany froze a contract that's been steady for nearly 20 years. The UAE began exploring alternate suppliers, quietly reaching out to Canada, Australia, and Brazil. None of these countries made a public announcement. They don't need to. Adjusting a purchase order speaks louder than any press release. Why? Because the issue wasn't that U.S. beef suddenly became unsafe or low quality. The concern was instability. Tariffs changing with every political gust, regulations flipping overnight, a trade environment where long-term planning feels almost impossible. Foreign buyers aren't fans of drama. They want straightforward supply, predictable pricing, and suppliers who won't blindside them with political turbulence. For the first time in a long time, the U.S. no longer looked like the safe bet. Inside the U.S., the fallout was immediate and painful. Beef destined for overseas markets began stacking up in cold storage. Some facilities filled so quickly that shipments had to be rerouted or delayed. Ranchers were told they might need to slow slaughter schedules, which is both pricey and risky. Export terminals grew congested. Trucks were turned around at the border with nothing more than a brief explanation: rejected. And the phrase that puts fear into every producer started circulating among distributors. We might need to hold off for a while. In an industry where margins are razor thin and timing is everything, that sentence is a financial gut punch. To understand how big a deal this is, you need to know how the U.S. has dominated the global beef market for decades. American beef wasn't just a product, it was a brand, a promise. Buyers around the world associated it with consistency, stability, dependability. Countries structured entire supply chains around it. Chefs built menus around it. But trust is fragile. Once it cracks, the damage spreads quickly. Canada saw the opportunity immediately and didn't waste a second. While officials in the U.S. tried to wrap their heads around the fallout, Canadian ranchers and exporters stepped up. They grabbed the contracts that suddenly had no supplier. They offered long-term deals. They emphasized reliability over rhetoric, something international buyers desperately want right now. Japan's retailers started stocking more Canadian beef. Southeast Asian distributors praised Canada for sticking to predictable standards. Buyers in the Middle East shifted orders originally meant for U.S. feedlots straight to Canadian suppliers. Canada didn't suddenly reinvent its beef industry. They simply positioned themselves as the stable option. Meanwhile, American ranchers were left navigating a storm they didn't create. Many already face brutal drought conditions. Feed, fuel, and equipment costs keep rising. And now, on top of everything else, the export demand they depend on is slipping through their fingers. Worse yet, there's an unspoken truth in global trade. Once a buyer switches suppliers, they often don't switch back. It's not personal, it's practical. Businesses stick with what works. Reliability outweighs price on the world stage. Restaurants across the U.S. are adjusting menus. Wholesale distributors are quietly blending Canadian imports into domestic supply to keep shelves stocked. Companies that rely on bulk orders, pet food producers, frozen food manufacturers, fast food chains are already feeling the squeeze. Economists are now running models that once seemed unthinkable. A world where American beef is no longer the automatic first pick in global markets. For decades, agriculture has been one of the United States' most effective diplomatic assets. Food exports help shape alliances and influence global politics. When that trust falters, America's global leverage weakens. And countries like Canada, Australia, and Brazil are not sitting around waiting for the U.S. to regain its balance. Canadian officials are talking openly about expanding processing capacity. Ranchers are forging long-term deals with Asian buyers who previously only purchased American cuts. Provinces are preparing incentives to boost production and infrastructure. This isn't reactionary chaos. It's long-term planning. Because Canada recognizes something Washington often struggles with. Global markets adapt quickly. If the U.S. wants to stay competitive, it can't rely on its history. It has to maintain trust. Meanwhile, Australia and Brazil see opportunity too. They've had their share of challenges, weather disasters, disease outbreaks, environmental controversies, but they know an opening when they see one. And right now, the U.S. looks vulnerable in ways it hasn't in decades. So here's the question running through agricultural boards, trade offices, and government strategy rooms. Is this a temporary shock or the start of a permanent shift? Some analysts are optimistic. They argue that if the U.S. steadies its trade policies, rebuilds buyer confidence, and addresses supply chain stresses, it could reclaim its place. Others aren't so sure. Once foreign buyers see that political instability can directly affect food supply, they diversify. And diversification, once done, rarely gets reversed. What's clear is this: the global beef market is moving fast, and for the first time in a long time, the United States is chasing it instead of leading it. Tonight, the North American beef industry didn't collapse, but it revealed a weak spot, a breaking point many hoped didn't exist. One rejection from Ontario triggered a global rebalancing. One tariff-driven dispute opened a door Canada has stepped through with confidence. One political misstep now threatens to reshape decades of established trade. And the question everyone is asking now isn't, how did this happen? It's far bigger. Can the United States regain control of its position, or has Canada already taken the seat America used to occupy? That answer isn't clear yet. But every major buyer in the world is paying attention.